Well, hello and welcome to Cedric Unplugged. Tonight's episode is called The Human Cost of Leadership. Leadership is often discussed in boardrooms, classrooms, and um, strategy sessions. We talk about decisions, we talk about outcomes, we talk about success, but sometimes leadership and sacrifice are revealed in the most human moments imaginable. Now, during World War II, in a small town in Illinois, military officers walked up to the front door of families and delivered the hardest message any parent could hear. Your son is not coming home. By the end of the war, that knock had happened 29 times in that small community. 29 families, 29 futures forever changed. My guest today has captured those stories in a powerful book called 29 Knocks on the Door, reminding us that history is not just about battles and strategy, it's about families, people, and the cost of service. So today, we're talking about memory, we're talking about sacrifice, we're talking about community, and what leaders today can learn from those who gave everything. I'm honored to welcome Joseph Nimmers to Cedric Unplugged Leadership Insights. Welcome, Joe.
I can't hear you.
Oh, you can't hear me? Well, audience, can you guys hear me? Let's see here. Just a second. Testing 1, 2, testing. Let me turn it on here on the internet and see if they can hear me. All right, let's see. Someone is commenting. Yes, they can hear me. So, Joe, can you check your settings?
I can see you. I can't hear you.
Okay, I'm gonna send you a message. Hold on. So I'm going to have Joe check his settings to see if give us a second. He can't hear me. We were just on before we went live, and he was hearing me just perfectly. So we'll see what happens here. Check your output settings. So while Joe checks his settings, I could hear his audio comes on, and it goes off and comes back on. So just give us a second here and we will get this situated. And audience, I want to make sure you guys can still hear me. I know Rose says she can hear me. Says all's working, seen and heard. Okay, so what I'm going to have Joe do is to go off and come back on. Off mute and camera on. Okay. Disconnect. It's weird. The minute we went live, I couldn't hear him anymore. And reconnect. That's the power of live internet. So he's going to disconnect and come back on. I'll bring him in the studio. We are going to be talking with Joe Nimmers about his new book, 29 Knocks at the Door. There are 2 volumes for this book. It's a great read, and we'll talk all about it this evening. So just give us a second for Joe to pop back in, and hopefully we will then hear his audio. We were hearing him perfectly. We were communicating before we went live. So give me a second here, and let's see. I see him popping back in. Get his camera on, and let's see. Can you hear me now?
Yep.
His camera's off. Hold on. Can you hear me now?
Yes, sir.
So you can hear me?
Yeah.
All right. So then now your volume, we don't hear you.
I think it's the NSA. They were worried about what I was going to say.
Amazing, folks.
I don't know. Everything else is working on here.
We still can't hear you. Let's see here. We're texting back and forth. It says you're in show. It says you're, yes, we're definitely. It says you're in show. All right, so the audience can hear. The audience can hear Joe. I can't hear Joe. That is weird. Okay, well, the audience can hear you. Then, okay, God is playing a little trick on us tonight. That's okay. What we will do is I'm going to call him on his cell phone, and he can talk. But you guys will be able to hear him. He'll mute his phone when he gets ready to talk to me, right, to answer a question. So this is funny. Oh, that's right. He is on his phone. So Joe, here's what. Right. So audience, okay. We figured something out. So hopefully you guys can still hear Joe. Give me a comment if you can still hear Joe, and I'll start with question number 1. We'll get going here. We're 2 military guys, we just adapt and overcome. So that's weird. So as soon as someone tells me they can hear both of us, we will get going. Okay, perfect. All right, so they can hear. So we're gonna get going then. Thank you guys again for joining 𝗟𝗲𝗱𝗿𝗀 Unplugged. We're talking with Mr. Joe Nimmers, author of 29 Knocks at the Door. So Joe, tell us what first led you to discover the story of 29 families in Libertyville, and who received that devastating message.
Well, Cedric, with me, there's no such thing as a short story. So this will take a second to tell you what
Sure.
happened. So during COVID, my alma mater, which is Arizona State University, offered all kinds of free courses. And in the course of that, one of the things they did do is they offered a master's degree online in World War II studies, which has always been the thing. And I thought, well, if I'm trapped here, I can't do anything else. It's all online. I'll sign up. And so I did, and I got about halfway through the program, and I was writing a paper about the Pacific Campaign in World War II. And by chance, I came across a series of articles from the Libertyville newspaper that were written by a childhood friend of mine who had taught at the high school forever as kind of a class historian. And he talked about the impact of the war on the high school. And he mentioned a whole bunch of names. And I had heard a lot of these names growing up because my dad graduated from Libertyville High School in 1947. So he was a little younger than these guys, but he knew a lot of them. And he, of course, went to school with their siblings. So I heard these stories, a lot of them as a kid, and just were in the back of my head. And I thought, oh, this is interesting. But in the course of looking at the articles, it wasn't written this way, but I found there were 4 guys from Libertyville, all became U.S. Marines, all who ended up at the Battle of Okinawa at the very end of World War II. And all 4 who were friends and classmates and student athletes and star athletes all died at the Battle of Okinawa in April and May of 1945. I said, well, that's got to be a story. So I did a lot of research and ended up writing the first book. There's actually a trilogy we're going to talk about. So this is called The Very Best We Had, and it was about the 4 Marines from Libertyville who went to Okinawa. When I finished that book, that's only 4 guys. There were 29 from Libertyville, unfortunately, who perished in the war. And I knew there were 25 other stories I had to write about. And so I did. And that's where 29 Knocks on the Door came from. And I ended up with 2 books, two volumes, largely because there's just so much to write about. And so I was writing, here in volume 1, and I did the math, and I said, you know what, I'm going to have to do 2 volumes because these are big books, about 500 pages. If I don't, the readers are going to not be able to lift up the book because it would be about like this big. So I cut it off at the first 14 guys, and that's what's here in volume 1. And then when I finished this last year, I just finished with volume 2, which I just published here last month. So it's actually a trilogy of all 3 books. It covers all 29 guys from my hometown that died in the war. And that's how it came to be. The title of 29 Knocks on the Door comes from the fact that during World War II, the only way that the government could practically manage casualty notification was through the use of telegrams. With 11 million people in uniform and 400,000 eventually were killed and 600-some thousand wounded and many more missing, they couldn't send a chaplain and a casualty assistance officer every time that happened. Just simply wasn't practical. It sounds heartless, but that was the only way they could manage through this. And so every family lived in dread of the knock on the door because you never knew when it was going to come if you had a child or a son serving overseas. So that's where it came from. In truth, there were more than 29 knocks on the door because some of these guys had been wounded once, went back into action, and were killed. Some got a knock on the door that they were missing in action, only to be found later and declared dead. So there were a lot more than 29 knocks, but that's where the title comes from, 29 Knocks on the Door.
Wow. A great story and good foundational information there. So when you began researching this, what surprised you about the lives of these young men before they even went to war?
I'll answer that in a second. I need to back up on one thing. So my hometown is Libertyville, Illinois. It's about 35 miles north of Chicago, just below the Wisconsin border. At the time of World War II, there were a little less than 4,000 people in the town, so it was a very small town. And you can imagine 29 deaths at any time in one town, much less a small town of 4,000 people. Yeah. So that's sort of the setting of what we're talking about. And it's only a few minutes really from the headquarters of that laboratories where Cedric and I met and where we worked for many years. Back to your question, there wasn't something that surprised me about their lives. The one thing that surprised me and I didn't know was actually about their deaths. Most Americans don't know this. I didn't know it till I wrote the book, but there were a little over 400,000 Americans who died in the war, in both theaters of war, in Europe and in the Pacific. They all were buried overseas, where they fell pretty much, or close to where they fell. And they were not disinterred and brought back home for up to 4 years. There's no way during the war that they could practically bring people back and forth. So what happened was, both on the Pacific Islands and throughout Europe, there were temporary cemeteries built, military cemeteries built close to the fighting. And as the fighting moved along, they'd keep digging cemeteries. And if a guy fell, then he was buried close to there. They took very good care to know where they were. They marked them. They maintained the graves. But they laid in those graves for up to 4 years before they were repatriated. In about 1947, the government started a program called the Return of the Dead. You'd think they could have come up with a little gentler title, but they didn't. But essentially what it did was it gave parents an irrevocable choice. They're going to go through this whole program, find these guys and bring them back. And a parent could either bring a son back to the United States, wherever they wanted, or they could have them buried in an overseas cemetery. What they did at the end of the war was all of these temporary cemeteries that were built in Europe, for example, most of them were converted into full-time American military cemeteries. The land was deeded by France or Luxembourg or Belgium or Italy, and they're still there, obviously. And then in the Pacific, there was one big cemetery in Manila in the Philippines, and then they created what's called the Punch Bowl, which is the National Memorial Cemetery in the Pacific in Honolulu, and they were brought there. So what ended up happening was they were buried twice, actually. They were buried overseas. They stayed there for a long time. So imagine the families for a moment. Your son's killed in 1944. You go through the notification period. There's no body. Maybe you have a memorial service. And then they were in touch, and 3 years later, you can bring him home. And then in 1948 or 1949, he's brought back. And it starts all over again, the grieving and the process. The difference is when they were brought back in 48 or 49, the war was over. America had moved on, and everybody wanted to move on from the war. And here comes these guys back again. So it was like a double sad situation for the families. But that was the biggest surprise, was understanding that they all were buried over there and kept there for up to 4 to 5 years based on when they died.
Wow. So, when you were researching these stories and learning about these young men, their dreams and their families and the lives that they hope to live, was there a moment where the weight of what these families experienced truly hit you?
Yeah, it's interesting. So there's 3 books. It took me 4 years to write them. I wrote almost nonstop for the last 4 years. And I described the process. It's physically demanding. You sit here and type 3, 4, 5, 6 hours a day. My wife kept coming, making me stop. And it's also emotionally demanding because most of these guys are a blank sheet of paper. I knew of their names, but I didn't know anything about their histories. And I'll describe it in a minute how I write about it. Other than I knew they had been killed in action. And so then as I piece their stories together, I write about their families going back multiple generations, where they came from. Most of them came from someplace else. What they were like as little kids, where they went to grade school, where they went to high school, what they did. And then of course I follow them into the military and eventually where they were killed. So it's an emotional process to write all of this. And an emotional process to some degree. I had a chance to meet with a number of the families that I got to meet through the book. And it's an emotional process for them, as I'll explain a little bit later about how many families did not ever really know what happened to these guys. They got a telegram and that was about it.
Yeah, I see that one of the Don is watching tonight, said that you wrote about his uncle, Lord Iverson, right?
Yep. Yeah, it's a good example. And I'm glad he's on. So Lloyd Iverson was one of the 4 Marines in the very first book. He's also covered in the second book, but he was in the first book. He was a Marine Corps fighter pilot. He was a night fighter. He was trained an extra year to fly at night, and he just started radar, and he had his F-6 Hellcat. And he was in an accident at night, of all things, of course, on the island of Okinawa shortly after the invasion began. And he collided with another aircraft at night, and then he died a couple days later. In the process of this, of researching the book, I got to meet Don and his older brother Gary, who actually wrote the foreword for this book. And then all the other siblings, most of them were all up in Ashland, Wisconsin, and be friends with them. And they had tons of information that they gave me. And while they had individual pieces of information, they never really knew the complete story of what happened to their uncle. And so 2 of the most gratifying things I hadn't anticipated that came out of writing the book, one was meeting the families and making friends with them. And there's a lot of them. And the second part was being able to present, because it's mostly their uncles. That's everybody in this book that's still alive today as family members, their nieces and nephews. And about my age, late 60s, early 70s. And they never really knew what happened, because one of the very common themes that happened with this generation was if you had someone killed in the war, typically nobody ever talked about it. And almost every family I talked to, they said, we knew he died, obviously, but we never knew the details. Either it wasn't provided or they didn't want to talk about it. And so while, in the case of the 𝗟𝗲𝗱𝗿𝗂𝗏𝗂𝗃, they knew they had an Uncle Lloyd and they had a lot of stuff about him, but the story had never been created to tell him exactly what happened to him. And that was really a good thing, a good feeling for me to be able to present to so many families their uncles for the very first time.
Sure. Yeah. And, a lot of people know about the statistics around World War II, but your book really focuses on the individuals, right? So, and you might have touched on this a little bit, but I just want to just make sure we really visit this. Why was it important to tell that story through the lives of their specific families?
Well, I was going down there a second ago. The way the books are written is each of these 29 guys is a separate chapter, and each chapter is a biography of each of these men. Mm-hmm. And so I start by going as far back into their family history as I can find. You'd be surprised. I'm going to write your family history one day. You'd be surprised how far back you can find things. So there's a guy in this book, his name is Private Lee Whitney. His family, I could find it went all the way back to Norman times in England. Now, I didn't write about those guys. I fast forwarded till the 1600s. There's another family that came over, and one of the first families that was founding the Pilgrim colony and the Mayflower and all that kind of stuff. So I go back and I show where the parents, the grandparents, the great-grandparents, how they migrated, how they got to where they were. And then I write about these individual men as whatever I can find about them as young people, where they went to grade school, high school, if they were required, what they did in sports, all the way through high school. And then I traveled with them through the military journey. One of the reasons, the big reason I did this is, for example, if you go in Libertyville to Lakeside Cemetery, it's the old public cemetery in town, been around a long time. There's a veterans memorial there, and it has the names of all people from the town who died in different wars going way back. The largest number, of course, are World War II. And what you see are their names, right? Or the year that they were killed, 43, 44, 45. You don't see anything about them. You don't see their pictures. You don't know what they did when they were kids. You don't know what they did in high school. You don't ever know what happened to them. You just see the names. And I think it's really important to have the memorial, but it's equally important to know everything we can about them. Last May, right after I did volume 1, I went to the Libertyville Memorial Day event in downtown in Cook Park. Mayor Johnson was there, and she talked about the importance of never forgetting. And she went very deep into her subject. We can't forget their names. We can't forget where they lived. We can't forget their parents. We can't forget when and how they died. You have to be, she was talking about all veterans who died in war, but I took it to heart to mean these guys. So it's really, you can't really tell the story about honoring your sacrifice. I mean, they gave up their lives for the rest of us. The least we can do is talk about them and explain everything about who they were. And that's the genesis of where that came from, was to be as complete and to tell their story as academically possible and thoroughly as I could.
Yeah. So one of the things that what I want to do is transition a little bit here, and we're gonna transition to talk about the families and the communities, right? So what I want you to kind of help frame for everyone is, what did you learn about how families process the grief when that knock came to their door?
Well, I'm sure, I know when the telegrams came to the door, because I can see from the military records, I have photocopies of what the telegram looked like, and it's stamped up on top when they delivered it. What I don't know exactly is, I'll give you one example in a minute, but I don't know exactly what the reactions were. I can only imagine. And again, these would have been most of them said, your son's been killed in action. Some said he's been wounded, and then you'll hear from us later. Sometimes they did, and some said he was missing in action. But you almost have to answer the question by providing some larger perspective, which is, I'm going to talk about this next week when I'm giving a lecture at the library in Libertyville. during World War II, America was all in. There wasn't anybody that wasn't in. We're not just talking about 11 million soldiers that were left to fight. Everybody was in. Everybody suffered. Everybody had to sacrifice. Everybody had to pitch in. Because there was food rationing of gasoline. No new cars were built. Very few houses were built. You couldn't get paint. Bakeries couldn't get enough to make just bread. They couldn't make donuts and cakes. Everything you knew was rationed. So everybody in power was limited. All kinds of things happened. So everybody was in. It was probably a lifetime in our country's history where there was complete unanimity in what had to happen. And what you see when I read, because I get their military files, I can see their casualty files, and I see the handwritten letters from their mother or their father asking about something, because how did he die? Where did he die? We can't get close. These heartbreaking letters. On the other hand, there's also in these letters this acceptance that their son died for a valiant cause. And they write that in there. They say, oh, my son, I'm sorry he's gone, but he died with his brothers fighting something. There was this sort of silent acceptance that this is the way it was. It doesn't make it any easier. It didn't mean they didn't grieve as awful as they could or they typically would. But there was this sense of national movement that this war was not going to be won without sacrifice. And you see it reflected in the commentary of the parents. It's a really interesting subtlety to see. But it just tells you about what was happening during those 3.5 or 4 years of the war and what was in people's minds. So I'm certain that they reacted very negatively, as you might imagine.
Sure.
Most of these cases, I've read in the papers that within a week or two of getting the casualty notification, there was a memorial service for them at their church or something. But you don't read or see much more. And like I said, in some of the family documents I was able to access, nobody talked about it. So there's no real record of what they did. You can just only imagine what that are.
Yeah. So now what I want people to really picture at this moment is a knock at the door, a parent opening it and realizing that the world is about to change forever. When we think of this moment, I want to think of the town of Libertyville, and I don't know if there was awareness at the time that there was all this many people from Libertyville. In your research, did you find anything that showed that the town of Libertyville collectively came together and helped these families as they were going through this experience?
Yeah, one of the things that with a town of 3,900 people, it was a pretty small town. And as you read both books, you'll see that a lot of these 29 men went to grade school together. They had not been in the same grade, but they were there at the same time. Same thing in high school. They lived within a couple of blocks of each other. Their families knew each other. They went to church together. They played sports together. So it was, today Libertyville's about 20,000 people, still not a big town. But then, I mean, when you say everybody knew everybody, everybody knew everybody. And when there was a knock on the door of one house, the whole town shuddered. I mean, it just reverberated very quickly because everybody knew who this person was. And there were several periods over the course of the war where bad news came in batches. In April of 1945, 2 of the Marines in that first book were killed in 1 week, and another guy in the second book. So there were 3 faces in the newspaper that week of guys from Libertyville that died. It was not a good week. So you see that kind of throughout. And so you really have to take into account the scale of the size of the town, the intimacy of everybody knowing each other, and what ended up happening. You know, the covers of the books are very intentional. I spent a lot of time on this. So this is the first one. You can see it. It says 29 Knocks on the Door, Volume 1. And it's a picture of a home in Libertyville. It's a real house as it would have looked in the 1940s. And it's taken from the perspective of the messenger coming up to the house and the people inside having no idea what's about to happen to them. And as you just mentioned, how their lives are going to be shattered forever. I wanted something different for Volume 2, even though we're talking about the same group of people. And so this one's taken from a different perspective, which is inside the house, in the foyer, looking out from the perspective of someone in the house. The family hears a knock on the door, they don't know who's there, and they're walking to see who it is. But both of the covers display the fact that they didn't know the notification was coming.
Wow. And just a quick note on the book itself. Like I told you, when I got this book, Joe, man, talking about an up-level experience, right? I mean, the cover is extremely nice. The pages are, in your encyclopedias back in the day, it was really nice, a really nice book, the feel of it. And then obviously I'm reading it as well. So it's a different level of experience with this book, not only the people in the book, but also the aesthetics of the book itself. So did you notice any common threads in the way that these families preserve the memories of their sons over the decades?
Yeah, and it's the thread that it was pretty incomplete. Most of them acknowledged that they were gone. They might have had a picture of them. In the case of the 𝗟𝗲𝗱𝗿𝗂𝗴𝗏, there was a trunk that had Lloyd's stuff in it, and it was rarely opened. There was just a sense of wanting to move on, and that's why, because the families themselves really had very little information eventually ever, unless a guy who was killed had a buddy come visit after the war, maybe write a letter, had a company come in to write a letter, maybe a chaplain. There's a few cases where that happened.
Sure.
They had no idea. They didn't know how they died. They didn't know where they died. They didn't know where they were buried for 3 or 4 years. And so it has this sort of compression on families where they just sort of go quiet. And so there really weren't a lot of, and I didn't come across any cases of families doing any kind of substantial memorial. I think they just sort of quietly accepted it. That was part of their sacrifice, and they moved on, and they never talked about it. So I can tell you, in the case of most of these people who I've met, the families, the parents of these guys who died, who would be the grandparents of these guys today, you just never would talk about it.
Wow. So, Joe, stories like this also challenge us on how we think about service and responsibility, right? So when we talk about leadership today, we often focus on influence and authority. But these stories remind us of something deeper, at least I think so, the cost that sometimes accompanies service. So I want to transition here and talk about leadership and service and sacrifice, because I think that the deeper part of this book, the deeper meaning of this book really ties on those 3 words: leadership, service, and sacrifice. So what do you believe modern leaders can learn from the sense of duty that these young men felt when they chose to serve?
I'm not so sure it's limited just to leaders. I think it's really for all of us. I've had a chance to speak to students at 𝗟𝗲𝗱𝗿𝗏 High School quite a bit over the last few years. The school does a remarkable job every year of honoring. They do it really around the clock with the honor veterans. And I've had a chance to go speak at some events. And one of the things I started with the first book. So on the back cover of this one about the 4 Marines, a friend of mine did a drawing of what these guys would have looked like in their uniforms. So one of them was an artilleryman, one was a tanker, one was a fighter pilot, and one was in the infantry. And they all joined. 2 of them were in the class of 41, one in the class of 42, one in the class of 43. They all joined shortly after Pearl Harbor. They became Marines. It was well known at the time that the Marines were only going to the Pacific. They didn't go to Europe. They'd be fighting the Japanese. At the time they signed up, they knew exactly the type of ferocity that they would receive when they got there. It was well known what was happening in the island hopping campaign as the Americans progressed north, and the savagery, the absolute savagery of the fighting. They knew that, and they enlisted. They weren't drafted. So they knew what they were going up against. They were 18, 19, 20 years old, and they went anyway. And I told the kids, if you want the very definition of a hero, that's what it is. You understand what the danger is, and you go anyway. And that's a lesson for everybody. It's not necessarily a lesson for leaders. It's really one for all of us. And the book is complete with stories. Most of the guys, most of these 29 were not drafted. The ones that were drafted, they were drafted before the war started, when the U.S. was starting to mobilize, knowing something was going to happen. The rest of them all enlisted all the way into 1944. And by then, everybody knew what was going on, and they didn't wait to be drafted. They wanted to go serve. And so, you know, it's a pretty remarkable example. They're called the greatest generation for a reason. But there's great lessons there in how to put yourself aside and go commit to something greater than yourself.
Yeah. Outstanding. So in your research on their individual stories, did you discover that there were moments that revealed their character or leadership qualities that these young men carried even before they went into war?
Yeah, because I can see their high school record. I mean, I can see what they did in high school, the clubs they were in, the sports they participated in. Many of them were, you know, class officers and things like that. And so these were good guys. I mean, they were good students. They were good kids. They were smart. It was not a surprise to learn that many of them were highly decorated and for bravery. And on the back cover, I'll read a couple of them to you. Sure. I talk about the awards that they were granted. There were 31 Purple Hearts, because some of them were wounded more than once. 5 Silver Stars. The Silver Star, as you know, is the nation's third highest award for bravery in combat. There were 5 of them. One guy in particular, a guy named 𝗨𝗱𝗱𝗿𝗂𝗧, he was a combat medic. He was awarded 2. Pretty difficult to get a Silver Star, much less 2. 2 Bronze Stars, 5 Air Medals, and Air Medals pretty difficult to get. Also 3 Combat Infantryman Badges. So they were highly decorated across the board. No surprise if you go back and make the link to how they were brought up, the values they were brought up with, and just what you could see of them as leaders in high school. It just, you know, just translated right on. There were no surprises. Right. You know, there was nobody that was the class clown that won the Medal of Honor. There was nobody that, you know, almost dropped out or did drop out. No, they all had records that would lead you to believe that they would do well in such an awful situation.
Wow.
And they did. They did.
Wow.
And I document all of that for each one of them.
Yes, you did a lot of documentation in this book. I was telling a friend of mine, I said at the beginning of each story reminds me of the beginning of Genesis, the book of Genesis. And that is this person, and this person begat this person begat this person, right? What you're telling the chronological order of when from their grandparents all the way up through their time in service, right? It's a very interesting to read about it and put yourself in the time that they were in, is what I tried to do when I was reading one of the stories here. So do you think that our culture today fully understands the weight of sacrifice that previous generations carried? Because, you know, some of these guys volunteered to go, and I'm wondering if our culture today, and I'm thinking, speaking of the younger generation, really understands the meaning of this word sacrifice. Give yourself before thinking of yourself.
Well, I mean, in terms of, do they fully understand the weight of sacrifice that took place? I think the answer is no. And that's a function of what's taught in schools. And, you know, the more we get away from something, the less is taught about it, because there's not enough room to talk about it.
Sure.
That's why I've been so interested in working with Libertyville High School, because they really talk about, they have a whole hallway of displays of kids, family members, grandparents, uncles, brothers, whatever, that were in them. It's kept up all year long. There's full cases. My books are in those cases. There's uniforms from guys who served in World War II. And then they have people like me come in and talk at Veterans Day or Memorial Day. It's very unusual that happens. You know, the other thing that doesn't help in terms of understanding the weight of sacrifice, as you well know, is only a very small percentage of our population who served in the military. And so they don't necessarily logically track to some of the stuff that you and I know or would be interested in. And so I think the answer is no, I don't think we fully understand the weight. There's a lot of, our country's pretty new. It's only going to be 250 years old. There's a lot of stuff there, but, and sometimes it can feel a little overwhelming to try and research it. But World War II was only 80 years ago. It was just 10 years before I was born. Not that long ago, there's still people around who were there during that time. But I don't think, as a whole, we appreciate the sacrifice or we understand that weight. I really don't. And that's just a function of time. I think it's a function of education. And whether or not we make it important, and it was the reason I wrote these 3 books. I don't want anybody to forget, at least for this town, who these guys were.
Right. Yes. So one of the things I'm going to ask you to do is, so you're going to have to go to Lake Charles and do the research there too. Okay.
I could spend a year researching you. That's all I know.
Okay.
You don't want to know. Cedric, I have tools that you have no idea what I can find out. So I've gotten pretty good at digging deep in all kinds of things. So be careful.
Okay. Stay away from Lake Charles then. Yeah. So, one of the most important things about history is that it reminds us that that legacy isn't built only in big moments, right? Sometimes it's built in quiet courage. So let's talk a little bit about the legacy these men left behind. So why do you believe that it's so important that communities continue telling these stories decades later?
Well, I think it's not only stories about the war. I think it's very important for any town to have a very good sense and an organized sense of its history. One of the things I wrote about in volume 2, and one of the reasons I wrote the books, was to contribute to the really rich local history in Libertyville. Libertyville's been around for 160s. I can lose track of 1830 something it's been around. But there's a wonderful tapestry and a wonderful sense of history in the town. There's quite a bit at the library. There's the Libertyville Historical Society I'm a member of that does remarkable work that helped me a great deal on all 3 of these books, but captures so much more of the town's history. In the case of talking about the war, there's the Legion and the VFW, there's the high school. There's all kinds of places that contribute to that. And I think any town is better when you have a real good capture of your history, and you continue to add to that and make sure it's kept vibrant. It's just really important. That 99% of the people may never use it or need it, but it's there and it's really cool. Now I'm a history major, so I was a little, and you're halfway through my credits, I'm a little biased, but I really think culturally, for any town, it's super important to be able to have all of that. And this is just my contribution to that for Libertyville.
Yeah. Well, awesome. And thank you for that. As you spoke with families and researched their history, was there one story that stayed with you the most?
I don't think there's one. Because there's so many of them. It's kind of difficult to say. It's one of the things that I like to talk about when we have more time is these are guys who were raised largely during the Great Depression. It was just an awful time in this country. It was a very difficult time to live. There was a great deal of mobility because families were constantly moving, chasing jobs, or $5 less per month in rent, and rent was $50 a month. And so there was a lot of instability going on for all of the 1930s. And you see that reflect, there's themes that go through that. So for example, in these 29 guys, all of them moved 4, 5, 6 times in their childhood, not because they wanted to or not for upward mobility, but just to try to survive. And not just within Libertyville, but in and out and back and forth. And that had a big effect on them, that sort of transient feeling, the instability, is my dad going to have a job, where are we going to get food from? They were all affected by, all but a couple of them were affected by that. So it's a series of stories that all kind of get woven together. I think of these 3 books as one book. because it is all 29. They're told in different ways. The thing when I had the first book is about the 4 of them on Okinawa. So I had plenty of time to talk about the Pacific Campaign and how America eventually got to the very last battle in the Pacific, which was Okinawa. It's an island very close to the Japanese homelands. That was the direction they were taking. So I could talk a lot about that in addition to the 4 guys. When I wrote the other 2 books, and I'm talking about all the rest of them, I can't do that. I mean, the book would have been this big had I done that. So what I do is I talk in each of their military journeys, and they get to Europe or they get to the Pacific. I give you little snapshots of what was actually happening at that time. Not just, they came to Luxembourg, but why were they in Luxembourg? Why? What was the larger thing that was happening with the American forces pushing the Germans back into Germany, for example? So it's all of these stories but there's not one that really stands out to me among all the other ones.
Okay. All right. So if any of the family members, like Don was watching earlier, if any of those 29 young men, families were watching this conversation today, right? What do you hope they would feel knowing that their loved ones are still being remembered today?
Well, they've told me. I mean, they're happy that they know. We become friends, all of us, as a result of that. I feed them a lot more typically than what's in the book. If I have pictures, I'll share it to them. If I come up with other stories, they give it. Sometimes they give me stuff back. But they know. I mean, I know what they know. They've told me that it's really good to find out what finally happened. Because, like in the case of Lloyd, when Don is listening, and I hope some of his siblings are listening, because we talk about his mom, who was her only sibling. Don's mom was Lloyd's only sibling. We talk about their grandparents, talk about their history, talk about the towns they grew up in. They knew all that. Some of that they didn't know. So I stitched the whole thing together for them. But by and large, they are very happy to possess the information really for the first time. There's only a couple of them that one in particular, there was a woman from the first volume whose father was a B-25 bomber pilot, was lost off of Italy. His plane was shot down, and she was born several weeks after he died. And she never knew him, and her mother remarried, and she was raised by her stepfather. And she had a whole series of information about him, but that was one of the few. So she knew what happened to him. There was a book written about his unit, and he was in there, but she was the only one that actually knew about it.
Wow. So there is something that you want the audience to know about these 2 volumes, or the 3 books, right, that we didn't have time to discuss tonight. What would that be?
That these were real people. I say that throughout the book. They were real. Their average age was 23. It skewed a bit because there were a couple of guys in their 30s. So they were all really 20, 21 years old. Every one of them left Libertyville thinking they were going to come home. I mean, I don't think anybody left thinking they were going to, but they all thought they were going to come back, pick up their lives where they left off, and get on from there. And they didn't, And 7 of them were married. 2 had kids. Those kids were born after they were left. They never saw them. So most of them, most of them weren't married. Most of them never became parents. Most of them, they didn't live to be grandparents. They didn't live to see what Libertyville became. None of those things. They never had a chance to live their lives. And that's really the most important thing to think about. So I have a lecture I'm doing next Monday night through the Historical Society at the library in Libertyville. And when I go to talk about the 14 or 15 guys in volume 2, I'm only going to show their photographs. I'm not going to put a slideshow up and show bombers and tanks. I'm just going to show, as I talk about each guy, because I want their faces in the heads of the people that are watching the program. Because that's the most important thing.
Yeah.
Is to see them as these very, very young men smiling in uniform before they went overseas.
Yeah. Outstanding. So, Joe, we have a segment on here before we close out. We have a segment on here that's called Rapid Fire. And so I want us to do that rapid fire segment, but it's going to be right in the same rhythm of what we're talking about here. So rapid fire is what we call the Leadership 10. It's 10 quick questions, no overthinking, just your first instinct. All right. So Gresh or LaFleur? Never mind.
If he's listening, I'm going to say you're official.
He wants you to say that. Trust me, you would have a long conversation if you did. No, one word that defines leadership.
Caring. You and I both in the military were taught the very fundamental rule when you supervise people is you take care of them. They eat before you eat. They're paid before you're paid. They go to bed before you do. They seek shelter before you do. Anything, that's what you have to do as a leader. And I think that's the one thing. And it's an easy translation. You and I both know that when it comes to our military backgrounds, that often doesn't translate well when we try to explain things to civilian audiences. But this is one that does. You know, caring at the very, it is an easy translation if you're a CEO or a manager or anything. So I would say that. I would say caring.
Okay. All right. A leader from history that you admire the most.
Winston Churchill.
Okay.
For a lot of reasons. You know, he's been named by a lot of places as one of the probably the most influential person in the first half of the 20th century. I was in England last year with Kathy this time, and I was thinking about what I should do for my picture for the book, the first book, volume 1. And so that's a picture of me in a hotel that Churchill used to frequent in a pose that looks like, I have a cigar in my hand, by the way, in a pose that looks very much like Sir Winston himself. But there's a lot of reasons. I have a lot of books about him. I have a lot of books by him. But he was really quite an extraordinary person.
Okay. One leadership trait every great leader must have.
Communication skills.
Okay. All right. A book that shaped your thinking.
Let's come back to that one.
Okay.
Sure. I read a lot of books.
Okay. All right. Courage or wisdom?
Wisdom. I mean, you can have courage and not a lot of sense, and you can get yourself killed. But I think wisdom is probably more important.
Discipline or passion?
Discipline.
A leadership lesson we should relearn from the World War II generation.
Commitment.
One habit that builds strong leaders.
Repetition.
Legacy or achievement?
Achievement.
The most important thing a leader owes to the people they lead.
The best effort possible.
Okay. All right. Any books come to mind?
I'll have to get back to you.
Okay.
We'll make that for our next visit on.
Okay. All right. So, history has a way of coming full circle. During World War II, officers knocked on those doors to deliver heartbreaking news. Decades later, you knocked on those doors, on those same doors, but this time carrying the story of the sons those families lost, right? So what was it like? We talked about the families and their experience. What was it like for you to stand there, hand the book to them and see how the families responded?
Well, first off, I have to back up. I didn't contact all 29 families. That
Okay.
would have been either too intellectually difficult or too emotionally difficult, but I did pick certain ones. I'll give you an example. So the first one I picked was the 𝗟𝗲𝗱𝗿𝗂𝗏 family, it was 𝗨𝗲𝗽𝗍𝗂𝗧's. And I contacted Gary, the oldest one. So what I do is I would look and see, as I was tracing the family history, I said, who's alive today, right? Well, the parents are gone, their siblings are gone, these guys. Who's left? Well, it would be their nieces and nephews. And in this particular case, and in each case, I would write a letter. I'd get their address, look it up with all my secret tools. And I'd send them a letter. And I'd say, I'm who I am. I would usually say, I'm not crazy. I'm a retired healthcare person. I'm writing a book. One of your family members is in here. Would you like to participate? And I tell them what I was looking for. And I also said, if you don't want to, I understand. And if you want me to give you all the research I have, and typically I did, military records that you don't have, whatever, I'll do that. And in every case that I wrote a letter to, and there's about 12 or 13, almost half of the 29, they all wrote back or called me right away and said, yep, I'm in, let's do this. So that's how it came about, long before the book was created and I had a chance to hand it to them. And that's how I met them and then worked with them through that process. There are some, Don, who's listening, is one of them, that have helped me on all 3 books. a number of these families because they had stories, they had something that was different, or they helped me with artistic. They have certain skills today that help me with the covers, for example, or help me with a quote that I wanted to use. So long before I presented them the book, I got a chance to meet them. And so by the time the book was written, they knew well what was coming. Sometimes I would send them a galley ahead of time and say, this is last chance to take a look at it. This is what it's going to look like before it goes to print. But it was very satisfying, like I said earlier, to be able to, in most cases, present them with their family member for the first time.
Wow. Well, before I do my wrap up and close out the show tonight, I want to thank you for being willing to come on the show and talk about this. And I know it's a big piece of work. I know that it took a lot of time, energy, and effort to put it together. Definitely very well done, and I'm going to continue reading it even after these interviews are over. So thank you again for doing this, because not many people would spend as much time, energy, and effort in doing this type of work. So thank you for taking the effort to do that. And thank you for coming on the show. I always, this is like your fifth time coming on the show. You're going to be just an old regular here real soon. So I appreciate it. So the story of 29 Knocks on a Door reminds us that history isn't just written in battles and strategy. It's written in families, communities, and the sacrifices that people make for something greater than themselves. So thank you for preserving these stories and reminding us of the human cost behind service and leadership. Audience, I want to thank you for honoring us and tuning in tonight, right? I'm honored that you're here tuning in to Cedric Unplugged Leadership Insights. I'm going to leave you with this closing line. History reminds us, remembers the battles, but families remember the knock on the door. The least we can do as leaders is live worthy of their sacrifice. So thank you guys very much for tuning in. I definitely appreciate it. I hope that I'm going to leave one note up here that Don just wrote here. Says, I looked into Uncle Lloyd's military records years ago and got back from the records department basic standard information. Joe came back to our family with tons of new information. That's powerful right there, right? Your effort, your energy, and attention to this. So thank you again very much. Hopefully, audience, you guys enjoyed it. Leave us more comments if you want to. We'll see you again next Monday night at 6:30 Central Time for Cedric Unplugged Leadership Insights. Thanks and great evening.